missing someone. With all your heart.
Hey, what's up you guys? Welcome back. I just want to take a second to thank all my new subscribers, and if you've been here for a while, thank you for your patience. I know it's been a while since I've uploaded. I've honestly had a lot of things going on in my personal life, and I've been extremely busy at my day job, and I just wasn't able to put the time and effort into a video like I normally would. But I'm happy to be back, and I have a crazy video to talk about with you guys. As you know from the title, we're going to be discussing the very brutal death of Sylvia Likens. Sylvia Likens was a 16-year-old girl that was living in Indianapolis, Indiana during 1965. Her parents left her and her sister Jenny under the supervision of Gertrude Baniszewski while they traveled with the carnival. They had only met her for a brief amount of time before making the decision to leave their children in her care. That proved to be the biggest mistake they had ever made, because just a few months later, Sylvia was tortured and ultimately murdered in the hands of Gertrude, her children, and various neighborhood children. I know we're going to be discussing Sylvia's life and death, but to tell the full story, I feel it's important to backtrack so that you can fully understand the Likens family. And we'll be discussing Gertrude Baniszewski and her family as well. So Lester and Elizabeth, aka Betty, were married on March 22nd, 1944. They both came from traditional American families and had a pretty normal upbringing. Within a few months of them getting married, Lester joined the Navy and left Betty behind in their hometown of Lebanon, Indiana. He served 2 years in the Navy, and quite honestly, I think that was probably the best time that he had in their marriage. When Lester returned back to Indiana, he had picked up a pretty nasty drinking habit. Though it's not specifically confirmed, it seems like he took a firm hand approach with his family, or as we say today, abusive. Nonetheless, within a year of his return, Lester and Betty welcomed a set of fraternal twins named Diana and Danny. Approximately 2 years later, on January 3rd, 1949, they welcomed a third child named Sylvia Marie Likens. They became pregnant again almost immediately, and within a year, they welcomed yet another set of fraternal twins, a boy and a girl named Benny and Jenny. This many children in such a short amount of time, combined with some serious financial troubles, really put a strain on the Likens' marriage. Despite having 5 children to care for, the Likens were not very stable. They were very poverty-stricken for the majority of their marriage. Lester had made some pretty bad business investments, even buying a restaurant from a scammer that didn't even own it in the first place. He was then forced to go work in various factories, and Betty was forced to pick up his slack. She worked as a bookkeeper and would clean people's homes, basically anything she could do to make ends meet. When Betty delivered Benny and Jenny, things kind of took a turn for the worse. Jenny had actually contracted polio, which left her disabled, and she had to have surgery on one of her legs. Shortly after that, Betty became ill and had to have surgery, which required her to stay in the hospital for an extended amount of time, obviously leaving her unable to care for her 5 children. Lester obviously still needed to go to work, so they were forced to find someone to watch the kids. This is where the Likens started to form a really bad habit. What should have been a temporary and isolated situation eventually became a sad story of neglect from both Betty and Lester. They would leave their children with family and friends for months at a time. When they did have them in their care, they were constantly uprooting them, moving them around so they'd have to switch schools. And it just wasn't a stable environment at all. Not only did they move approximately 20 times, but Betty and Lester's arguing had only increased, and they would fight in front of the kids quite often. Once Betty recovered, she and Lester traveled throughout Indiana with the carnival. They would sell sodas, beer, and sweet treats as a way to pay their bills and try to get away from the financial strain they were under. It proved to be lucrative, and they were able to save enough money for Lester to start his own cleaning business. But at what expense? The Likens decided to finally put down some roots when Sylvia was about 7 or 8 and purchased their first home, which was located in Indianapolis. Business was booming, and after about 2 years, they decided to upgrade and get an even better home. They moved to 3838 New York Street in Indianapolis, and both Lester and Betty believed they were on the right path. Their children attended school there for about 2 years, and had plenty of friends in the neighborhood. But that stability and happiness would be short-lived, and they eventually fell on hard times again. They were forced to sell their home in Indianapolis and once again uproot their children and move back to Lebanon. So it's clear that Lester and Betty didn't make the best choices. They would eventually close down their business and would go back into the carnival business, which is why we're even talking about this today. This instability continued on into 1965 when Sylvia was 16. By then, she had grown up into a respectable young woman. She was kind of shy, quiet, and obedient, and maybe even a little insecure because she had accidentally knocked out her front tooth when she was 7. Lester promised her that he would get her a false tooth, but he never followed through, and it just made her uncomfortable. So she would purposely smile with her mouth closed to hide it. She was smart, but because she had attended so many different schools, she eventually fell behind and decided to quit high school in February of 1965. At that time, the whole family went to Long Beach, California for about 4 months. I believe Lester, Betty, and the 2 boys were working for the carnival, so Sylvia ironed for people while she was there to earn her keep. Like I said earlier, Jenny was disabled, she had a severe limp, and was forced to wear a steel brace on one of her legs. Diana, who was 18 at the time, was already married and became very distant from her family. Sylvia really enjoyed California, and she even got a boyfriend. Once the carnival gig ended in May, the family returned to Lebanon, and this is where our story really starts. Within a few weeks of returning, Betty and Lester had yet another argument, which resulted in Betty leaving, and she took Sylvia and Jenny with her. They found a house in Indianapolis in their old neighborhood and did not tell Lester where they went. A few weeks went by and Lester was out looking for them without any success. Betty was trying to remove herself from that toxic environment, and she did not want to see Lester. Moving to Indianapolis had cost Betty most of the money that she had saved. She was just down to her last dollars. The 3 of them didn't have much other than some clothes, and Betty was arrested for shoplifting at the beginning of July. I don't know what she was shoplifting specifically, but given that she had never been in any trouble, and she was in rather extreme circumstances, I want to believe it was for a good reason. When Betty was arrested, Sylvia and Jenny went to their friend Darlene McGuire's house. They knew her from when they lived on New York Street. They went over there and played for a while, and I think they even had dinner with them. Throughout that evening, Darlene introduced them to a girl named Paula Baniszewski, who also lived in that neighborhood. They all hit it off and really enjoyed each other's company, and even made plans to meet up the next day. The girls went to their empty home at dusk and spent the night there alone. The next morning on July 2nd, they woke up bright and early and headed over to New York Street. They were eager to spend the day with their newfound friends. Sylvia, Jenny, Paula, and Darlene spent the day together drinking sodas and listening to records. They genuinely had a great time. Lester was finally able to track them down, but the girls did not want to leave. They filled him in on what was happening and told him that Betty was arrested. Gertrude Baniszewski, aka Gertie, overheard them telling Lester this and invited him into the house. He accepted and came in for approximately 30 minutes. They chit-chatted about what was going on, and Lester told Gertie that he had to get going because Betty wasn't home. She insisted that Lester and Benny stayed for dinner. He and Gertie went and picked up White Castle burgers for everyone. At some point throughout the conversation, Gertie offered to care for Sylvia and Jenny and told her that it would help her out as well. Lester said that he needed to speak with Betty about it, but it would really help him out because it was a busy week for the carnival and he needed to get on the road. Gertie swore that she would care for those girls like they were her own. She was a single mother with multiple children and no job, and she really needed the money. That evening, Lester and Benny again tried to leave, but Gertie insisted that they stay the night and drive back to Lebanon the following day. Yet again, Lester accepted. He later went on to testify that he slept in a chair, and Benny slept on a pull-out couch in the living room. He stated that he never went into any other room of the house, apparently not even the bathroom. The next morning, Lester woke up before anyone else and started a search for Betty. He found her at her mother's house, sitting on the front porch, worried sick about the girls. Lester told her that they were safe and they were staying with the Baniszewskis on New York Street. He filled her in on what had happened and told her what Gertie had offered. However, Betty was not comfortable leaving the girls. Lester continued to push for them to get back together and leave for their carnival gig. He told her that he thought that they wouldn't fight as much if the girls weren't around. Apparently, the two were able to settle their differences because Betty ultimately agreed to the arrangement, as long as she was able to meet Gertie first. They agreed that they would be able to pay Gertie $10 a week per girl, which would be about $160 a week in today's world. They had no real idea who they were leaving their daughters with, or that Sylvia would be murdered just a few months later while in her care. Before we get into the story of what happened while Sylvia and Jenny were living there, I want to take you through a little bit of background about the Baniszewski family, specifically the mother, Gertie, and the older daughter, Paula. Gertie's life started out rocky and never really improved. She had a strained relationship with her mother when her father suffered a heart attack when she was 11, and he dropped dead right in front of her. When she was 16, she married a police officer named John Baniszewski, dropped out of school, and left home as soon as possible. The two did not have a happy marriage. John was abusive and would frequently fly into fits of rage and beat Gertie for very small things. They eventually got divorced, got remarried, and divorced again by 1963. Throughout their marriage, they had 6 children: Paula, Stephanie, James, John, Marie, and Shirley. Gertie had actually been pregnant 5 additional times, but suffered a miscarriage every time. Because she couldn't stand to be alone, Gertie married another man named Edward in between marrying John the first and the second time. Their marriage ended after only about 3 months because he got sick of her kids and he wanted a way out. After the second divorce from John, Gertie started another relationship with a man named Dennis Lee Wright, who was only 23 at the time and was 14 years younger than her. She later said that he was abusive towards her, but regardless, she became pregnant again twice, miscarrying one baby and giving birth to another named Dennis Jr. Dennis didn't want to financially support Gertie's other 6 children, so he left her shortly after the baby was born, never to be heard from again. That obviously put Gertie in a difficult situation financially. She had 7 kids to care for and did not receive the financial support from either of the exes. She claims that she had fallen ill with numerous illnesses, but she was actually abusing prescription medications and would spend any money she got to feed her habit. Which is why, when the opportunity presented itself, she was eager to take on 2 other children. Before we jump back into July of 1965, I want to talk about some key people that were involved in Sylvia's death. Obviously, we're going to be discussing Gertie, her 17-year-old daughter Paula, her 15-year-old daughter Stephanie, and her 11-year-old son named John. We're also going to be discussing a 14-year-old neighborhood boy named Ricky Hobbs and 15-year-old Coy Hubbard, who was Stephanie's boyfriend. The younger children were around and involved, however they were not tried or convicted. There were also numerous other children from the neighborhood that were involved, however they were not charged. Alright, getting back to where we left off. Betty and Lester showed up to the Baniszewski house knowing that they were going to leave the girls. Betty made sure that they were okay with it, and the girls seemed excited because they were having so much fun hanging out with Paula. They discussed everything with Gertie and told her that they would be back at the end of August. They agreed to pay her $20 a week total to care for both of the girls. They gave her $20 on the spot and promised that they would send a weekly payment. Betty and Lester never asked where the girls would be sleeping, nor did they ask to see any bedrooms. They never once did a full walkthrough of the house. In fact, they simply stayed in the living room for the entire 30 minutes that they were there. Had they walked through the home, they would have discovered that there was hardly any furniture at all. There were 9 people living in the home, but only enough beds for 4 of them. In the kitchen, there was no working stove, and there were only 3 sets of dishes, which was obviously not enough for so many people. Literally, they had like 3 spoons. There was hardly any food in the house, and only bread and crackers could be found in the cupboards. Another thing that should be noted is the house was completely filthy. Almost every surface in the entire house was covered with dirt. Nonetheless, the Likens hugged their children goodbye and handed Gertie her $20, unknowingly leaving their children in the hands of a killer. The first week that the girls were living there went great. They were having a great time hanging out with Paula, and the kids would leave first thing in the morning to go to the park and stayed there until dinner time. The girls attended some social events together at church, and it seemed as if the temporary situation was going well. However, things would quickly change when Lester's $20 payment was late the following week. When the check didn't arrive on the day they agreed upon, Gertie decided that the girls needed to be punished for their father's incompetence. She flew into a fit of rage, had a complete meltdown, which resulted in screaming at Sylvia and Jenny that she had taken care of them for nothing, referring to them as bitches in the process. At that point, she forced the girls to lay over her bed, pulled their skirts up and underwear down, and spanked them with a paddle. This sadly would not be the last time that Gertie would punish the girls in such an extreme manner. I think it should be noted that she did receive the payment from Lester within a few days in the mail, which proves that she was simply overreacting. There were also times that Gertie would receive her payments early. Lester and Betty would come and visit the girls every couple of weeks, and each time they would pay her in advance. Lester even gave Gertie extra money for things like tennis shoes, gym suits, and lunch money for the girls. They of course never saw that money because Gertie chose to keep it for herself. She continued to abuse both of them, both physically and emotionally. Things only got worse as the summer progressed. In August, Sylvia and Jenny did what most kids did in the 60s. The girls went out to search for Coke bottles so they could sell them back to get money for candy. When they returned home with the candy, Gertie assumed that they had stolen it. She refused to believe Sylvia when she explained how they got the money. Sylvia was then punished for lying and was once again beaten with a paddle in front of all of the children. This type of abuse eventually became a habit, and it seemed like Gertie was beginning to pick on Sylvia for even the smallest things. Even things that the other kids were doing and Sylvia was not even partaking in. Anything bad that happened, Sylvia was automatically blamed for. Even though the abuse was getting worse as time progressed, the girls never mentioned any type of abuse to Lester and Betty, despite them visiting between 8 and 10 times between July and September. This is most likely because they were afraid of what Gertie would do if she found out. Gertie's son John would later go on to say that at some point, his mother, along with himself and his siblings, took on a mob mentality when it came to Sylvia. One weekend, while attending a church picnic together, things took a turn for the worst. The Baniszewski children went to their mother and told her that they were disgusted at the amount of food that Sylvia was eating during the picnic, and that she should be punished for it. Gertie, being someone that was very concerned about her appearance to other people, told Sylvia that it was unacceptable that she would do something to ruin her reputation. Gertie flew into a fit of rage because Sylvia tried to tarnish her reputation. The family had brought leftovers home from the church event, and Gertie force-fed her hot dogs soaked in various condiments, to the point that Sylvia vomited. At that point, Gertie became even more angry because Sylvia had wasted perfectly good food and forced her to scoop up the vomit and eat it. From that point forward, the family began to degrade Sylvia any way they could. She was no longer allowed to wash her hair or wash her clothes in the sink. Sylvia was strong and smart, and a little defiant when the abuse started occurring. She wanted to show Gertie that she would not be able to break her spirit. Unfortunately, this ended up making her suffer even more. One day in August, Gertie overheard Sylvia talking to Paula about a boyfriend that she had when she was in California. She stated that she made out with him and he felt her up. Gertie once again flew into a fit of rage, screaming at Sylvia that she was filthy and began calling her a prostitute. She then told her children, even the ones that were under 10 years old, that Sylvia was a prostitute because she let a boy touch her genitals. Gertie then began to beat Sylvia, repeatedly kicking her in her genitals. Once the attack was over, Sylvia attempted to get up and sit in a chair. At that time, Paula, who was 17 and 3 months pregnant, by a married man I might add, told her that she wasn't fit to sit in chairs and threw her on the floor. Sylvia was not allowed to sit on furniture unless Gertie told her she could. The following day, still upset about what had occurred the previous evening, Sylvia allegedly made a snide remark about Paula and Stephanie to another classmate. She claimed that she had seen them having sex in exchange for money, which, knowing what we know about this family now, wouldn't surprise me at all. The rumor spread throughout the school, and when Stephanie told her boyfriend Coy Hubbard what had been said, the two returned to the Baniszewski home with the intention of beating Sylvia up. They walked in the door, and Stephanie immediately approached Sylvia. She screamed at her and punched her in the face. Coy then took a turn, beating Sylvia until she was laying on the floor. They told Gertie what Sylvia had said, and as you guessed it, things got worse from there. Gertie encouraged Coy to beat Sylvia every time he came over, allowing him to practice his karate on her. He enjoyed picking Sylvia up and slamming her on the floor, and if she dared try to defend herself, it would result in a beating. When Jenny ran into her older sister Diana at the park, she took a huge risk and told her about the abuse that was happening, telling her that Gertie was severely punishing Sylvia, but unfortunately Diana did not believe her. She thought that Jenny was just upset about being punished. Around this time, a family moved into a vacant home next to the Baniszewskis. They were new to the area and were looking for someone to watch their two young children. The mother recognized that Gertie was a single mother just trying to make ends meet, and she wanted to help her out. She arranged a barbecue so they could get to know each other and introduce the kids to Gertie. And that's when the woman noticed that Sylvia had a black eye. She asked who had given it to her, and Paula proudly chimed in that it was her because Sylvia was troubled and out of line. At that point, Paula got a glass of scalding hot water and threw it at Sylvia's face. Apparently, this family didn't find any issue with that and decided to let Gertie watch their children anyway, and they never reported that incident to the police. The family became somewhat close to Gertie over the next couple months. They again noticed Sylvia walking around, disoriented with swollen lips and a black eye, which was so bad that it was swollen shut. The woman again asked what happened. Paula took off her belt and began beating Sylvia with it to show her what happened. And the woman still never called the police to report the incident because they believed that Sylvia was simply being disciplined and that they should not get involved. During late August, Sylvia was caught stealing her gym uniform because Gertie refused to give her the $2 for it, which, like I said earlier, Lester had given to her. Sylvia stole the uniform to avoid getting in trouble with her teacher. When she showed up at home with the uniform, Gertie knew right away that it was stolen and forced Sylvia to confess to what she had done. Gertie insisted once again that Sylvia was a prostitute. She attacked her, kicking her in her genitals repeatedly. She then took a lit cigarette and began to burn every single one of her fingertips with it. I honestly don't understand how Sylvia was able to go to school another month while these attacks were happening and no one did anything. Lester and Betty came to visit the girls 2 more times. Once in September and the last one being on October 5th, just a few weeks before Sylvia died. And while some of the worst abuse was occurring and they did nothing. They later claimed that they never noticed any injuries on Sylvia, but I find that hard to believe. How is she walking around with black eyes and they noticed no injuries? Seems a little sketch to me. Lester expected Gertie to have a firm hand, and I think they blindly overlooked what was happening, apparently believing that Sylvia was simply being punished rather than abused, which was obviously not the case. On a few occasions, Betty and Lester took the girls for sodas, and they claimed that they didn't even mention it even while away from the Baniszewski home. When they did come to visit, the visits only lasted for approximately 30 minutes, and they only visited every couple of weeks, and once a month in September and October. And get this, when Lester and Betty were done traveling with the carnival, they decided to head to Jacksonville, Florida, and bought a lunch stand instead of picking up their daughters. I can't imagine being away from my daughter for 2 weeks at a time and only visiting her for 30 minutes when I did get to see her. The Likens had zero parenting skills, and it shows. Anyway, Sylvia attended her last day of school on October 4th, visited with her parents for 30 minutes on October 5th, and that's exactly where her real nightmares began. Gertie began convincing neighborhood children, even Sylvia's friend, that she was spreading nasty rumors about her parents around the school, which was obviously false. But she was doing this to convince them to fight Sylvia. During one of those incidents, Gertie forced Jenny to punch Sylvia right in the face. When she refused, she was beat until she agreed to assault Sylvia. Once she was forced to withdraw from school, Sylvia did her best to stay busy. She helped Gertie around the house and even babysat for a family once or twice. She decided to go out and sell Coke bottles yet again, hoping to make a little bit of money so she could send it to her mother to help the family. When Sylvia returned home, Gertie assumed that she had been out selling sex in exchange for money. She refused to believe her when she said that she was selling Coke bottles back. Gertie had grown ill and had become very weak. Because of this, she chose not to beat Sylvia for her sins. Instead, she told her sons and other boys in the neighborhood to gather around in the living room and forced Sylvia to strip down in front of them. Sylvia refused at first, but gave in when Gertie said she would beat Jenny if she didn't do what she said. Once Sylvia was fully nude, Gertie handed her a glass Coke bottle and forced her to use it to perform a show for the boys. One of the boys was 14-year-old Ricky Hobbs, who lived in the neighborhood. From that day forward, he basically became a slave for Gertie. His mother had been in the hospital for quite some time, and his father was always at work. So Ricky would frequently spend time at the Baniszewski home. He followed Gertie around like a lost puppy dog. He would do whatever she told him to, even if it was completely out of character for him. Ricky came from an upstanding family and was an honor student. It's widely believed that Gertie began sexually assaulting him and using sex to manipulate him, which is why he listened to anything she said. Following this incident, Sylvia became unable to control her bladder and wet the bed that her and Jenny were sleeping on. Gertie told her that if she was going to act like a dog, she should have to sleep with them. She then had Coy and John take Sylvia to the basement and tie her up to the basement stairs, coincidentally where they kept their puppy. The conditions of the basement were absolutely deplorable. It was unfinished and there was no toilet or bed. This forced Sylvia to sleep on old clothes and rags, and she had no choice but to use the restroom on the floor. She was given her own bowl and cup because the other people in the house did not want to eat after her. They frequently called her a dirty girl. When Gertie discovered that Sylvia was using the bathroom on the floor, she began giving her baths that were just another form of torture. She would tie Sylvia's wrists and ankles and would repeatedly dunk her in the family's bathtub that was filled with scalding water. Paula would help her mother by rubbing salt in Sylvia's wounds afterwards. This would sometimes happen multiple times a day, while other times, Sylvia was forced to live with feces and urine on her body because she had nothing to clean herself up with. Sylvia spent the next 2 weeks of her life in that basement, naked and alone. The family continued to use and abuse her, and she continued to be a punching bag to everyone. The Baniszewskis also used this situation as a way to make money. They would charge neighborhood kids a nickel to come see her like she was a fucking zoo animal. For a little extra, they could burn or kick and hit her. Some even pushed her down the stairs, which had become a fun game that the Baniszewski kids would do daily. Sylvia was no longer fed on a daily basis. Her diet only consisted of saltine crackers and water. She was frequently forced to drink her own urine. John, who was only 11 at the time, put a bucket in the basement for Sylvia to defecate in and then forced her to eat her own feces. In the week leading up to her death, Gertie took a dirty diaper down to the basement and forced her to eat the feces out of it. So, needless to say, Sylvia suffered through some very brutal treatment that ultimately led to her death. On October 21st, Gertie had John, Coy, and Stephanie bring Sylvia up from the basement and told her that she could sleep up there that night, if she could control her bladder. Given the trauma that her body had been through, Sylvia was not able to do so. Gertie discovered that Sylvia had wet the bed yet again, and she once again flew into a fit of rage. She told Sylvia to get dressed and had all the boys gather in the living room. Gertie forced Sylvia to strip down in front of them and perform another show with a Coke bottle. Afterwards, she told her to get dressed, but in the midst of Sylvia doing so, Gertie started screaming at her about the lies that she was spreading about Paula and Stephanie. Screaming, "You branded my daughter, so I'm gonna brand you." Sylvia was then stripped down, gagged, and forced to the floor. Gertie then told her children to heat a needle on the stove, to the point that the end of it was glowing. She then burned the letter I and the letter M into Sylvia's stomach. The smell of burning flesh became too overwhelming, and Gertie had to leave the room. She told Ricky to spell out "I'm a prostitute and proud of it" on Sylvia's stomach. He again blindly followed, unbothered by what he was doing. At one point, he stopped and asked Gertie how to spell prostitute. Gertie left Sylvia in the hands of Ricky and her kids. Ricky, Paula, and Shirley decided to burn the letter S for slave into Sylvia's chest. Ricky carved the bottom of the S and then attempted to force Jenny to carve the rest of it. She completely refused despite Ricky's threats. He then told Shirley, who was 10, to carve the rest of it. Because she was so upset, she accidentally carved the rest of it backwards, so the S looked like a 3 on Sylvia's skin. Gertie then came back into the room to taunt Sylvia even more, stating, "What are you going to do now, Sylvia? You can't get married now. You can't undress in front of anyone. What are you going to do now?" Sylvia was then allowed to respond, and she told Gertie there was nothing she could do. Once they were done branding Sylvia, she was then taken to the basement so that Coy could practice his karate moves once more. She was then left down there overnight. Sometime throughout the night, Jenny snuck down there to visit Sylvia. Sylvia told Jenny that she could tell she was going to die. That same night, Gertie went to the basement to help Sylvia upstairs, where she was allowed to sleep the rest of the night. Around noon on October 23rd, Gertie and Stephanie woke Sylvia up and took her to the bathroom and gave her a normal bath. Gertie then had Sylvia write a dictated runaway letter to her parents, which she addressed "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Likens" instead of "Dear Mom and Dad." Gertie then told her to write, "I went with a gang of boys in the middle of the night, and they said they would pay me if I would give them something. So I got in the car and they all got what they wanted. And when they got finished, they beat me up and left sores all over my face and body. And they also put on my stomach, 'I am a prostitute and proud of it.' I have done just about everything I could just to make Gertie mad and cause Gertie more money than she's got. I've tore up a new mattress and peed on it. I also cost Gertie doctor bills that she really can't pay and made Gertie a nervous wreck and all her kids." Gertie then told her not to sign it. Sylvia overheard Gertie telling Jenny and John to take her to a garbage dump nearby and leave her there to die. When Sylvia realized that's what was happening next, she ran toward the door as fast as she could. But unfortunately, she moved so slowly that Gertie was able to drag her back into the house. Gertie then made Sylvia some toast, but she was so injured that she was unable to chew or swallow it, which led to yet another beating from Gertie, this time with a curtain rod. She was then taken to the basement, and Gertie sent a plate of crackers down there for her to eat. When Sylvia refused the crackers, telling John to feed it to the dog, he repeatedly beat her in her stomach. The following day, Gertie attempted to end Sylvia's life, first with a chair, and then by beating her over the head with a paddle. Gertie missed, accidentally hitting herself in the face with the paddle, and blackening her own eye. Coy then decided to help Gertie and beat Sylvia with a broomstick, to the point that she was unconscious. That night, when Sylvia awoke, she found the scoop part of a shovel in the basement. She used all the strength that she had left to beat it into the concrete floor over and over again, hoping that one of the neighbors would hear it and call the police. However, no one ever did, despite neighbors later reporting that they did hear the noise in the middle of the night. On the morning of October 26th, Gertie had the kids bring Sylvia up so they could give her a bath. She was put into the tub fully clothed and was then removed immediately after when they discovered that she was not breathing. Stephanie immediately began giving her CPR, but Sylvia was already dead. Gertie told the kids to take Sylvia's body to the basement and had them strip her down. Because they had no working phone in the home, Gertie told Ricky to go to a payphone and call the police. As soon as the police showed up, Gertie gave them the letter that she had forced Sylvia to write. But Jenny quickly shut that shit down when she told them that she would tell them everything if they got her out of there. Jenny told the officers what was really going on, and they wasted absolutely no time arresting Gertie, Paula, Stephanie, John, Ricky Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard for murder. There were also 4 neighborhood children that were present at the time that were arrested for battery. An autopsy was performed on Sylvia's remains, and they determined that she had over 100 cigarette burns on her body, paired with other second and third degree burns. She had severe bruising and muscle and nerve damage. Her genitals had severe injuries and were nearly swollen shut. Sylvia's official cause of death was brain swelling, internal hemorrhaging of the brain, and shock. Gertie, the Baniszewski children, Ricky, and Coy were all held without bail until the trial began in May of 1966. Stephanie was granted a separate trial, but John, Paula, Ricky, Gertie, and Coy were all tried together, though they each had their own lawyers who tried to blame each other. The trial was basically a shit show. Gertie allowed her attorney to shift the blame onto her children, claiming that she was too sick and weak to have any idea of what was going on. Gertie testified that Sylvia Likens was known as the neighborhood prostitute and would frequently have relationships with married men, also stating that she would cause issues within their home. Gertie was ultimately found guilty of murder in the first degree and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole instead of the death penalty, which people were shocked by. This verdict came after Gertie's young daughter Marie got on the stand and basically spilled everything. She screamed, "Help me God," before turning on her mother completely. Gertie eventually appealed and was granted a new trial. She was ultimately found guilty yet again, but her sentence was changed. She was then sentenced to 18 years to life. Throughout her time in prison, Gertie became a model prisoner. She got a job and became sort of a mom to other prisoners. When it came time for Gertie's parole hearing, the entire state was furious that she was even up for parole in the first place. The Likens family spoke out against her about being released, and they had multiple groups supporting them and rallying against it. These groups were able to collect 4,500 signatures from Indiana residents, begging the parole board to keep Gertie in prison. However, they were ignored by the state, and Gertrude Baniszewski was granted parole and was released from prison on December 4th, 1985. She immediately moved to Iowa and changed her name to Nadine Van Fossen. She died only 5 years later from lung cancer. Paula was convicted of second-degree murder initially. She actually had to be excused from the trial to give birth to her baby, that she conceived at 17 while having an affair with a married man. Does anybody else see the irony in that? Paula was eventually granted another trial and ultimately took a plea bargain, pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter. She served only 6 years in prison before being released. At that point, she changed her name to Paula Pace and moved to Iowa. She then got married and got a job working for the school district in Conrad, Iowa. She first worked as a custodian and then got promoted to a teacher's aide. She worked with special needs students, but was suspended in 2012 after an anonymous tip came in and police and the school conducted a background check on her, only to discover that she had pled guilty to manslaughter. John Baniszewski, Coy Hubbard, and Ricky Hobbs were all convicted of voluntary manslaughter and each sentenced to 18 months in juvenile prison. Once John was released, he changed his last name as well. He has spoken out against his mother and about the abuse that he has suffered, which he claims is what led to his anger and participation in Sylvia's death. He was never arrested again and has a successful career and family of his own. John has also said that he deserved a harsher sentence, so clearly he does have remorse. Ricky Hobbs was released and suffered a mental breakdown. To cope with what he had done, he picked up a very severe smoking habit and died from lung cancer by 21. Once he was released, Coy Hubbard remained in Indianapolis and had a family of his own. He was tried for another murder in 1982, but was later acquitted. He lost his job in 2007 when the movie An American Crime was released, and he has since died. Getting back to the Likens family, Betty and Lester have both passed away. The couple finally divorced in 1967, and Betty later remarried. Sylvia's older sister Diana moved to California and had a family of her own. She lived a pretty normal life up until recently when she found herself on the news yet again. She and her husband, who were both diabetics, got lost in the desert in California while on their way to their son's house. Their car broke down and they were forced to live on rainwater, a single pie, and some oranges. Her husband suffered from a heart attack and unfortunately died the first week. Diana was nearly dead when she was rescued, having been out in the desert with limited resources for nearly 2 weeks. Jenny sadly had a hard life after Sylvia's death. She obviously lived with the trauma and guilt after witnessing her sister's death. She stayed in Indiana and sought therapy. Jenny eventually got married, but sadly died in 2004 at the age of just 54. She was never really able to move forward. I don't really know what else to say about this case. Obviously, it's very sad and disturbing, and I feel sorry for the children that were involved. This yet again shows if you see something, say something. I recognize that the 1960s were a different time, and things like that were overlooked and ignored most of the time, but these kind of things still happen today, and they shouldn't be. There is a movie based on this story called An American Crime. I definitely recommend watching it. It's a great movie with a great cast. However, it doesn't tell the whole story. Some of the things they got incorrect or glossed over for Hollywood. Do you think that the sentences they got were fair, or do you think they should have received the death penalty? Let me know in the comments. If you guys have a case you want me to cover, leave a comment below or fill out my suggestions form. The link's in the description. But that's all I got for you today, guys. As always, remember the name Kasey Shane. I'm out.